No one is interested in a major war on the European continent with Russia. Only a lunatic would be interested in that. The Russians aren't interested in it. That's what people don't get.
So recently, Colonel Douglas Macgregor was on Daniel Davis's podcast to talk a little bit about the war in Ukraine, where it's at, and particularly why Zelenskyy can't exactly get the deal he wants right now. There's been a lot more negotiations between the US and Russia lately on this, so let's watch and let's react. And please like the video, subscribe to the channel.
Perfection is the enemy of good enough, but good enough is not a deal. Good enough means everyone has looked at their interests and everyone understands everyone else's interests, and we put together the best possible solution, fully recognizing that no one involved is ever going to get everything they want. And I think Mr. Putin knows that, but he's dealing with Zelenskyy, who has no incentive to do that. He has every incentive to stall, every incentive to spoil opportunities for any resolution, because resolution will lead to his immediate demise. He will be through. He has no future once he enters into a peace agreement. Everybody talks about Netanyahu being totally self-serving and wanting war because peace is the enemy of his future. Well, that may be true, but in this man's case, Zelenskyy, that's also true. He is not interested in any sort of arrangement whatsoever, because once he reaches it, he's through, because he's never going to get everything that the people that back him want him to get. It's impossible.
Now, yeah, this is why Zelenskyy actually fears the right-wing nationalistic forces in his country more than he fears Putin, because his ass is essentially on the line here. He could have accepted an agreement in Istanbul that was very close to being accepted, that would have yielded him all of the occupied Donbass territory, the stuff that Russia occupies now, those locations. But he's never going to get that again. And you see that Zelenskyy wants to demand these security guarantees from the US and Istanbul plus in terms of territory, and it's something that it's just completely impossible. It's why the US can essentially ignore Ukraine entirely and deal directly with the Russians. The US is bankrolling this anyways, and it's the US who, if they withdraw their aid, is going to have to force a peace. Either Europe will have to, follow through on their pledges that Starmer and van der Leyen and Macron have made toward securing Ukraine and fighting the Russians on Ukraine's behalf, that they'd have to follow through with. I don't think they're going to do that. And for all these reasons, Zelenskyy is just trying to stall. He wants continued support from the US to get more territory than is even remotely possible. You've seen him do other gambits, like purport that they had arrested 2 Chinese soldiers, which more than likely looked like Korean soldiers. We know that North Korean soldiers are fighting on behalf of Russia, and actually the North Korean government just announced that for the first time, I believe, yesterday. So we all know why Zelenskyy can't get the deal he wants at this point.
I suspect that President Trump is now aware of that. I think that they see that Zelenskyy the fact that after some of these declarations that the U.S. desire to move down a certain path, to have a ceasefire, to have an energy ceasefire, not a Red Sea, but a Black Sea deal, to whatever, none of which ever transpired, because then instead of doing those, you had the Zelenskyy side literally throwing the president, the vice president, and Witkoff multiple times under the rhetorical bus, clearly indicating he's not willing to move on his position. So I think that with Trump saying within 3 days he's going to have some kind of announce his deal, I think probably means that he's getting to the we're going to cut you off point. So the question I got to you, first of all, as Zelenskyy mentioned a minute ago, he's going to have, or else his representatives are going to have meetings in London, I think starting tomorrow. And then according to what Gary showed up there from Russian media is reporting that Witkoff is going to be in Moscow sometime after that. So it appears that the sequencing is, and from what I can understand in reading the tea leaves, we're going to issue something close to an ultimatum to the European and Ukraine side in London, and then whatever comes of that, Witkoff is going to go to Putin and say whatever they're going to say. What do you expect to happen in each of those 3 cases?
Just so we're clear here, actually Witkoff did meet with Putin already over the last 2 days, I believe. And this is really interesting because Witkoff has probably the most vested interest in the Trump administration of securing a peace. He seems to genuinely want that. But in some ways, it's so frustrating because Trump campaigned on ending this war right away, and he restored aid to Ukraine after shutting it off from a few days after Zelenskyy waltzed into the White House and that spectacle unfolded. Trump had the entire 2024 campaign season to come up with a prospective draft arrangement that would lead to the peace, but we have been dilly-dallying for a few months, continuing support to Ukraine. So I'm trying to be fair to Trump and say that, hey, I love the fact that we're now dealing with the Russians directly to try to get the U.S. out of this mess. But at the same time, I do think Trump has dragged his feet to some extent here, and it's not a good thing for the American populace.
Nothing good. Frankly, the Europeans can do nothing without us militarily. That's simply a fact. So the first thing that has to happen for any sort of arrangement with Moscow is that we need to end any further military aid or support to this criminal regime in Kiev. We need to understand what kind of society and state we're dealing with in Ukraine. Remember, this is arguably one of the most corrupt, maybe the most corrupt countries in the world. Now, that's not something that the Ukrainian people necessarily embraced. It's something that happened to them in the aftermath of the destruction of the Soviet Union, and they've never really recovered from it. This is not going to work. In other words, you go and meet with the Europeans and say, we're going to say X, what do you think? They're going to oppose you. Well, that's fine. You've got to understand where you stand vis-a-vis the Europeans. I would argue that President Trump's position vis-a-vis Europe today is similar to President Eisenhower's position vis-a-vis the British, the French, and the Israelis in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. He needs to turn around and say, that's it. We're out. We will not support any more action against Russia under any circumstances. We are going to normalize our relations. We strongly urge you to do the same. And if you don't want to do that, that's your affair, but bear in mind, this is where we're going. Now, that makes sense. If that's part of his deal, then that's fine. But if he goes to Moscow and says, well, we want to do a deal with you, which is nonsensical language, frankly, but we can't because we can't just walk away. And I'm afraid that that's the kind of thing that will trap the president. He should never have allowed himself to be trapped into this to begin with. He is right. This is not his doing. This is not something he wanted. So there was no reason to jump on this bear trap, which is what he's done. He's got to get out of it. Now, we're not going to get out of it and look as good or strong or capable as we would have had he done this back in January. But the position is still there. He can still get out, which is what he needs to do.
This is so right. I'm so with Douglas Macgregor on this. Trump's rhetoric and instincts on Ukraine were so good. I want people to stop dying. That's what he said. But the only way to get to that point, I believe, is to stop being what Russia considers to be a belligerent in this war. And that is how Russia views the U.S. The U.S. is bankrolling this war to the tune of over $200 billion at this point. Now, some of that got washed out and sucked in by the military-industrial complex and other profiteers, of course. But that is Zelensky's lifeline. And Zelenskyy kind of waltzed into the White House as if he owned the U.S. Treasury, that he was entitled to it. And Trump was right to say that you're gambling with millions of lives and you don't hold the cards. That was the Trump we need to solve this by cutting Zelenskyy off. He's America's biggest welfare mom, and we can't afford it anymore. That is what will result in a peace because Ukraine and Europe will have no choice at that point. Vladimir Putin has shown no propensity to invade Ukraine proper. Only the eastern part and the Donbass regions that were culturally Russian and wanted to be part of Russia in the first place. And the idea that he's going to reconstitute the Soviet Union, it's just CIA and CNN propaganda that you hear. That he's going to invade Poland tomorrow, that guarantees a World War III, a hot war, because of Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So all this is nonsense. The U.S. just needs to stop aid. Otherwise, he's going to be bogged down in a quagmire, a financial quagmire of continuing to have to support this. So Macgregor is 100% right here.
Doug, one of the things that may help him get there is, ironically, what may happen in Europe during these talks here, potentially tomorrow. You mentioned a minute ago that what's in the strategic interest of the United States is to get back to a normalized situation with Russia for all the reasons you've mentioned. We could go into more if you want. But who's not on board with that? Ironically, it's not Zelensky, it's NATO.
Well, there will be no normalization of relations with Russia when the war is over. That will not happen. That will take decades because there is a total lack of confidence. The threat is still there. As I said in my speech, even if the war comes to a conclusion, the Russian threat is still there. They are building a war economy. They are spending so much money on defense. They are producing in 3 months an ammunition what the whole of the alliance is producing in a year. We are ramping up our ammunition production. Luckily, we have to. There's no way that we can normalize relations with Russia after the war is over.
This is so comical. They're spending so much money on defense. What's the U.S. spending on defense? Well, actually, the first $1 trillion Pentagon budget was proposed. And Pete Hegseth lauded it and praised it and said, hey, look at how badass we are for having the first $1 trillion Pentagon budget. It's the U.S. that is creating a war economy and an empire building economy and is exerting its influence militarily all throughout the world. Through proxy wars, through strikes on Yemen, through aid to Israel, through occupation of Syria, and through bankrolling this proxy war, this disastrous proxy war against Russia.
Yeah, so what does he think? And actually, this is a question for you. What do you think is the message that Russia hears when he says that kind of thing, and what will be their reaction?
Well, first of all, Secretary General Rutte needs to summon all the Dutch, Belgian, German, and French forces available, take stock of it, and begin this 10 to 20 year program that's designed to create the high-tech equivalent of a Maginot Line between Western Europe or Europe in general and Russia. See how that goes. I think he's delusional to the point of absurdity. The populations have recognized, all you have to do is look at the polling data, particularly in the two countries that I consider to be the most important, frankly, from this standpoint, are the Germans and the Poles. And those populations have made it abundantly clear they don't want a war with Russia. What this man is promising is a condition of permanent hostility on the European continent towards Russia. He's a lunatic. There's no chance of that happening. He's going to be gone here shortly in the next few years. New people are going to take over and say, what planet is this man on? This is not 1900. This is not 1945. This is not 1980. We live in a different world today. The world is much smaller. The consequences of military confrontation are far more serious. And you're dealing with a very different Russian state from anything we've ever seen. It is certainly not Soviet-like in any way, shape, or form. It is somewhat more czarist in many ways, but Russia itself is very focused on building prosperity, improving living standards, ending these conflicts, getting along with its neighbors. This is not a state that one has to prepare to fight in perpetuity. So it's just nonsensical. He'll be gone. All these people are going to be swept away. There's no future for this globalist nonsense of which he is very much a part.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with them here. This is not the Soviet Union that we're dealing with in the form of Russia. In fact, they've had really no acquisitions that, marked the Soviet Union, like all of the Eastern Bloc that was conquered by Stalin and his successors. You have Crimea being taken as a result of a referendum in which Crimeans voted by a margin of 97% to be part of Russia. And then you have Putin, who backed into a corner, decided to occupy the Donbass region. Again, not to justify it, but we're not seeing the Soviet Union that is building up arsenals to attack Europe. They have defensive arsenals because of the NATO expansion and the U.S. empire building. That's what we've seen here. So I think Macgregor is totally on point here. It's so ironic to see Russia, of all countries, construed as a war maker when my own government, I hate to say, has been far more guilty of that. And The sooner that the U.S. pulls out of NATO or starts defunding it, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
And what about the Russian reaction to this? It seems to me that if you are talking about, like you just mentioned there and drew that whole picture about all these places that need to start this ramping up, you have Ursula von der Leyen already talking about this $800 billion European buildup, et cetera. I mean, it seems to me that that's going to cause Russia to say, well, we have to take you at your word, so we're going to continue to build up our forces afterwards, except they're starting from here and we're starting from somewhere under my table.
I think von der Leyen and the rest of these people are completely out of touch with financial and economic reality. Germany's being systematically deindustrialized and I would say almost fatally harmed by her own governments, thanks to their globalist colleagues. So I don't see that anything is going to happen in the near term remotely like what they're advocating right now. They're very much like Zelenskyy. They're going to be making these same ridiculous comments when they're removed from power. It's only a matter of time until these people are swept away. It's coming. Everybody says, well, how do you know that? Well, we have several hundred years of European history that teach us that lunatics like this eventually are removed. It takes time. It took 5 years to go from some semblance of order to complete chaos in France after 1789. But then eventually what happened? It ended. All of those people were removed and they moved down a different road. This is going to happen all over Europe. So I wouldn't worry terribly about Mark Rutte, who seems to think he is in command of some great military power that's ready to march at a moment's notice. And there's something else here. Remember, everybody should go back and read the speech that President Putin gave to the industrialists, the economists inside his own country. It was a very good speech because he talked about the future. And he made it very clear that Russia's future is with BRICS. He said Europe is gone for the moment. Maybe they'll come back, but at this point, we're moving on. We are focusing to the east and to the south. That's where our economic future lies. Does that sound like someone who's getting ready to invade Europe? Hell no. He's not remotely interested in it. But he's essentially saying these people are unbalanced in their thinking and behavior. So for the moment, it's pointless to discuss any sort of future economic or financial, let alone political arrangements with them. They're incapable. That's a very good speech. Everybody should read it. And that will explain where Russia is now headed. So frankly, Rutte is like King Lear raging at the storm. He's irrelevant.
Yeah, I have to agree with them there too. I mean, at some point it seems like trepidatious and fearful that you could have a new Cold War develop between Europe and Russia, even after or if the U.S. withdraws all support from Ukraine. But you have to see the track record of these people. They're paper tigers that pledge money to support Ukraine. Look, Ukraine's not going to be able to continue to fight without being bankrolled by the U.S. Like Macgregor says, they're not in a financial position to do that. You see all this, rhetoric coming out of Starmer and Macron and van der Leyen that just doesn't have the propensity to be actually implemented by these countries. They don't have the political capital to do it either because while there are a lot of people fearful that, with the insane idea in my mind that, again, Putin will reconstitute the Soviet Union and invade Poland tomorrow, it's just not what a large percentage of the populace thinks. There are people that think that, but they don't have nearly the capacity and the military-industrial complex to support this kind of thing like the U.S. purports to, but is also leading to inflation and debt, of course.
Yeah, and I think that's I think once people get a chance to find out what actually does happen and all these fear-mongering things don't materialize after this war is brought to an end and after, I hope, President Trump does indeed make good on his threat and walks at the end of this week, that will be fantastic. It'll cause all kinds of near-term chaos, but then when things settle down, as you mentioned, it took 5 years in the French situation. Probably won't take that long this time, because I think that Europe is not going to be ready to throw a bunch of more money into a dead hole I think that they'll come to a grip, and we'll see that things actually settle down and the war can actually stop. That's certainly the way I hope it works out. But I guess we'll wait and see on that.
The thing that's so striking is this tremendous failure of imagination in the West.
Yeah.
There's just no imagination anymore. There's no thinking about the reality. They're not looking at the world as it is. They see an illusion. They cling to it and refuse to give it up. They're going to go down hard, very, very hard. And the sooner they go down, the better for everybody, because no one is interested in a major war on the European continent with Russia. Only a lunatic would be interested in that. The Russians aren't interested in it. That's what people don't get.
It's so true. Shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, you had George Kennan, who was the architect of the containment strategy against the Soviet Union, and said, what are you guys doing thinking about NATO expansion? This is not Khrushchev or Stalin. This is Boris Yeltsin's Russia. This is a Russia that doesn't have the same propensity for expansion and war making. What are you guys doing? You're throwing my life away. You can see that interview between him, George Kennan, and a New York Times journalist when the Clinton administration started to propose the first wave of NATO expansion, when they had dug their heels in and said, hey, contrary to the Bush administration's promises to Gorbachev and contrary to Hans-Dietrich Genscher's promises to Gorbachev, we're just going to begin NATO expansion into the East, include additional powers, a trajectory that would end in 4 or 5 waves now of NATO expansion, where we've been led down this primrose path, as John Mearsheimer has called it. The primrose path is something that, it looks like it will allow dominance to be expanded, but really it ends up in perdition, in hell, in a disastrous policy. And that's what we've seen in this proxy war versus Russia. So let's hope that progress can be made, even while the U.S. is funding one side of this war. But ultimately, I think Macgregor's totally right. It's just going to take Trump to have the good impulses he had when Zelenskyy was in the White House to mock him, ridicule him, and withdraw all support for Zelenskyy, as should have been the case from day one, from even before the time he had chosen to met with Zelenskyy, because that was his rhetoric anyway. That's the mandate he has when he was elected also. But I do want to hear what you guys think. Please let me know in the comments below. Do you think there will be a peace agreement between Russia and the U.S., or Russia, the U.S., and Ukraine anytime soon? Let me know in the comments below. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll see you in the next one.